Miccosukee waters for your sons and for your daughters. Land of the clan of the panther and the otter. Flow, Paheoki, flow. The river of grass must flow. Bobby C. Billy taught us to listen. In the waters of the glades we were christened. So we formed this coalition. Flow, Paheoki, flow. The river of grass must flow. Now we hear wild creatures crying, cypress trees weeping and sighing. Walk for Mother Earth, no denying they're dying to be left alone. They're dying to be left alone. Flow, flow, Miccosukee waters for your sons and for your daughters. Land of the clan of the panther and the otter. Flow, Paheoki, flow. The river of grass must flow. Now we hear wild creatures crying, cypress trees weeping and sighing. Walk for Mother Earth, no denying they're dying to be left alone. They're dying to be left alone. Flow, flow, Miccosukee waters for your sons and for your daughters. Land of the clan of the panther and the otter. Flow, Paheoki, flow. The river of grass must flow. The river of grass must flow. The river of grass must flow.
I'm happy to be welcoming some special guests tonight, including the Honorable William J. Osceola, also known as Popeye. And we'll also be introducing our other guests very soon. But I'd like to welcome and introduce Honorable William J. Osceola, also known as Popeye, to offer us some words that we can contemplate before we get started with our session. So I'd like to check in with Popeye and see if he's ready.
Hello, Shintamo, everybody. Can you guys hear me okay? Just want to make sure my equipment's working all right.
Yes, sounds good.
Shanabashat Houston for that introduction. I would have to make one point of contention. I don't know how much I've earned that honorable title, but I am the secretary. And you folks, so my government name is William Osceola, but I do prefer to go by Popeye. That was a nickname given to me by my grandmother, Evelyn. So it's good for marketing, and it also reminds me of my roots and how much my grandma means to me, quite honestly. But no, I do want to thank you folks for, first of all, inviting Houston to do the series with your people. You know, that's meaningful outreach to us. And then also inviting myself and Edward, our legal counsel on the environment, to join you folks as well. You know, it's always nice to be reminded that there are folks out there who actually understand where the priorities should be, because quite often that's not the reality tribal nations face. Again, it's also nice to know that we're not being relegated to the back burner, as has always been the case. And quite frankly, it seems to be a lot of spiritual or religious-minded people who tend to do outreach first to tribal nations. In the past, that hasn't always been so, you know, good intentions, but not so mindful of letting the people themselves lead. So I do appreciate that as well with you folks for keeping that historical connection, but being mindful of what maybe the missteps were in the past. It's all a learning process, and I see you folks are here to learn as well. So thank you all again. Shanabashat.
Mato, Papai, thank you so much. That was awesome. You can give that a second as we contemplate that brief message. Thank you again. All right. So as we begin with tonight's workshop, we're going to check in with one of our participants. I know that we're starting this series of workshops with the land acknowledgement process, like writing one for ourselves, and then we're going beyond that into action. And so I'm going to invite one of our participants tonight to share their land acknowledgement, what they've created, what they've composed.
This is called Moving Through the Land of Tears. I was 6 years old, second grade, Santa Maria, California. My father said we had to buy a house. There was no choice. Nothing was available to rent. There was no rental housing because down the road were Lompoc, Vandenberg Air Force Base, the space program, trucks pulling long trailers through the city streets, trailers with huge rockets, missiles to fire at Bikini, atomic bombs for Bikini and Nuatak, tests, temporary evacuation until the Micronesian people, U.S. possessions, soon safely would return. They did not return. My parents bought the house on Chumash lands. I cried when we left Solvang, when we left the mission where the other captured Chumash had been trapped and held as slaves. I cried when we left the town where the Chumash first rebelled. I knew stories of the missions, stories that white children hadn't heard. My grandfather made certain that I knew. He sent me books. I cried for the oak trees, acorns rattling down like hail, for the rattles of the snakes and the rattle of the creek, for Nawahi, the waterfall, and for the fire orange poppies. I was 6. I cried for the ghosts I left behind. My parents bought a house on Chumash land. No one paid the Chumash people. My father paid developers. My father made a switchback path up the hill behind the house. There were birds and horny toads. The sand dune was beautiful. Then more houses came. For Santa Maria, the mission, La Purísima, was 20 miles away. The Spanish had held people there, locked in at night, and in daylight worked as slaves. When Spanish padres saw the joyas, the jewels, the transvestites, they had soldiers bring the giant dogs, the monster mastiffs. It was sport to watch the dogs chase and rip apart living Chumash bodies. Blood mixes with the sand throughout the long valley. Santa Maria Valley, La Purísima, is a state park. California calls it the crown jewel of historic buildings. Junipero Serra, the leader of the Padres, the father of the missions, has been crowned Saint Junipero. Blood and tears wash around his sainted feet. The Chumash did not cede this land to the Spanish. I have not met any Chumash people who agreed to any of this. The bones of ancestors are buried in the missions. My family moved through the valley of their tears.
Mato. And if anybody wants to express through reactions or waving of the hands or anything in the chat, that was great. Thank you, Kat. In that land acknowledgement, I saw instances of Chumash rebellion. I saw an eco inventory through poetry, and you definitely had a clear recording of history and its legacies through your prose and poetry. So that was great. Thank you very much, Kat. I really appreciate that.
Wado.
So as we get started tonight, I just wanted to offer just a review of where we've been and where we're going. The kind of work that we're doing in these workshops, again, is worth repeating, that we are learning, that we are listening to guest speakers, Indigenous speakers from local and international Indigenous communities, and we're working on service projects. We're moving past land acknowledgements and into action. And when we think about action, whether it's action plans or service projects or volunteerism or what have you, we're in the past 3 weeks or so, we have gone from broad to specific. And some of us have been making good progress too. When we think about the service projects or the action plans that we're working on, I know that some of y'all have gone from concept, like an idea, like what can I do? Some of you have created plans already, and that's awesome. And then those of you have already started doing that work too, like implementing that, and that's great. So thank you very much. Now tonight, we're going to be highlighting Miccosukee visions, perhaps some eco concerns, and we're definitely highlighting and uplifting voices of Indigenous leadership. So throughout the past couple of weeks, so a lot of y'all have been, all of y'all have been doing research, and I'm sure you've been finding goodies, great resources. So I'm going to invite y'all to just think about that, and as you remember them, or if you have access to them right now, go ahead and put the links that you've been relying on in the chat box so that we can develop a resource list. So tonight, you can start doing it now, and over the next few minutes, as you remember, as we continue, just drop us some links of great resources that you found, or where you found your resources, whether it was online or in libraries or archives or what have you. Just go ahead and drop those links in the chat, and then we're going to save that and then share it with the rest of the crew here, rest of the group, all of you. And I know that there's been some folks that need some additional assistance or need additional ideas, or you just want to workshop some things that you're working on. I'm happy to connect with you. So feel free to reach out to me by email. You can do so at info@lovetheeverglades.org. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Linda Sechrist, to continue with the program and tell us more about our guest speakers tonight. Thank you, Linda.
Our first guest speaker will be the Honorable William Popeye Osceola, who taught language, culture, and digital arts at the Miccosukee Indian School before he was elected Secretary of the Miccosukee Business Council in 2021. In his early 30s, he is the council's youngest member, balancing tradition and modernity with a creative flair. As secretary, he is in charge of all aspects of communication within the tribe, including record keeping, handling correspondence, publishing notices about meetings and events, and keeping track of tribal membership. Some of his goals, including shaping future leaders by placing an emphasis on education, increasing community involvement, and investing in infrastructure to improve roads, sidewalks, and important buildings within the reservation. And our other guest speaker is going to be Edward Hornstein, Esquire, is enrolled member of the Southeastern Miccosukee Nation, a state-recognized tribe in Alabama. He serves as special counsel on environmental affairs for the Miccosukee Tribe of Indians of Florida, and as the co-chair of the American Bar Association's Indigenous Law Committee. Edward earned his Juris Doctorate from the University of Arizona with certifications in Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy and Environmental Law, Science and Policy. His work for the Miccosukee Tribe since primarily focusing on the management. So we're inviting our special guests into a conversation, and I believe the first one we're going to hear from is Popeye.
Hello. So Edward's actually going to go ahead and do this along with me, so we'll kind of be tackling this together, and we just find that kind of works a little bit better that way. So we're talking about Big Cypress broadly and this whole designation, but I do want to set the table because I find that there's a lot of people who don't always understand how we even ended up here. So I guess we'll go a little bit broadly, and then as we progress to that history, you kind of get an idea of kind of what we've done in the past to protect the environment and why we're so tied to this environment. For those who weren't aware, we weren't always primarily located within the Everglades and Big Cypress area itself, the Miccosukee tribe, although we've had historical ties to this land for centuries, as far as we can tell. You know, we have oral traditions and songs and things like that that kind of reinforce that. And quite frankly, a lot of these indigenous teachings, it's more for us to keep in-house. We're not always willing to share that with outsiders because it is so ingrained in our culture and our being that, you know, we're very protective of that knowledge. But again, our own oral history tells us of our deep connection to this part of the land. But before we were settled out here, we were located more up in the Alabama, Georgia area and northern Florida. But around 1819, we were chased out of our lands. If you look up in the map, you'll see Lake Miccosukee and the town of Miccosukee. So you could put two and two together and surmise, oh, I guess Miccosukee was up there. And you were correct. But following the Creek Wars and the First Seminole War, that was no longer the case, thanks to the duelist Andrew Jackson. And I like to say that because a lot of people don't realize, you know, he shot a few people in duels, and that's the kind of guy he was. So that's the kind of attitude he took towards us. Edward, is there anything you want to kind of add on that part?
Sure. I mean, I think to your point, there is a lot of good documentary evidence to support the oral histories that at least some portion of the ancestors of the modern Miccosukee tribe originally resided in the Everglades and were of the Tequesta and Calusa people, while that majority of the population was probably from North Florida. But other than, you know, how crappy Andrew Jackson is, I think he did a great job.
Yeah, maybe I didn't reinforce how bad of a person he was. But if you know your history, you know that Andrew Jackson is the primary driver of the Indian Removal Act, 1830s. And that was actually a great instance of failure of checks and balances on the American government side. You know, the Supreme Court threw a court case with the Cherokee tribe, I believe, right? In Georgia. Was it McIntosh or something like that, the case?
It was a trio of cases: Johnson v. McIntosh, Cherokee v. Georgia, and Worcester v. Georgia.
Yeah, so the Supreme Court basically had said that Jackson didn't have the authority to remove these natives from their lands. And even after that, he did it anyway, and nobody stopped him. So, you know, that's a great little instance of like checks and balances and how citizens have to hold their own government accountable, and why, you know, you can't always trust the government to do the right thing. Which is going to tie back into where we are later as we get to the Big Cypress stuff. But, you know, following that, there was a couple more Seminole Wars, of which we were a part of. And without going too much into it, I think it's where a lot of confusion stems on who we are as a people today because of that name Seminole, which is a tricky term, you know. That's something that became attached to us after those wars because of non-natives identifying who we were, which has always been an issue, you know, how non-natives identify natives. That's how you end up getting, oh, Miccosukes are part of the Creek Confederacy, even though at the time, none of those tribes were thinking, oh, we're a big confederacy. We call ourselves the Creeks. But following that Seminole Wars, 1880s, you have America expanding. They have been doing a lot of railroad buildings. Sorry if my R's are a little tricky because, you know, in our language, we don't have R's. So sometimes when we say words with that, it kind of comes out a little sloppy. But so America was expanding, building railroads, and they started building into Florida. So they're coming out here to do surveys and whatnot. And they start noticing some stuff with the land, and that the land's going to be a little bit tricky to work with, especially because of all the swamp areas. Edward, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I guess the River of Grass at its widest point went from one side of the coast to the other. So everything that exists in South Florida that is not either a swamp or a tree island was built by dredging and filling that land.
Oh, I forgot one important piece of context. So at the end of the Seminole Wars, you're seeing that take place during the removal and relocation era. So that's why the government was, you know, focused on getting these tribes off their land and shipping them off to somewhere else to reservations. And then by the time you get to people coming out to survey the Everglades post-war era. That's getting into the allotment and assimilation era. So that's when American government was really starting to focus on I believe the common philosophy at the time was kill the Indian, save the man. So that's the mindset that the government was operating on at the time. But getting into the 1900s, you have the Everglades Drainage District inaugurated by Governor Napoleon Bonaparte Broward. Edward, if you want to go ahead and add some flair to that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, whenever there's a Napoleon, you know that things are about to get rough in world history. And what we saw as a lead up to that is the U.S. Congress commissioned a report, and an attorney went down named Buckingham Smith. He drew up this report in the 1860s that said the only way to make the Everglades a profitable and livable place is to drain the swamp so as to get rid of the bugs and the reptiles, including the Indians.
So you can imagine what that does to an environment, even when you don't follow through on the plan, and that's what your plan is, though, like drain all of the swamp. And all of these canals and levees and things like that are a result of that mindset. So moving forward a little bit, around 1917, 1918, you start to see the construction of the Tamiami Trail. So that includes more dredging, and that really started to upend tribal life as it was at that time. At that point, it was pretty relatively peaceful. The American government after the Third Seminole War wasn't so focused on the Everglades, so these were considered good times for my people. Game was abundant. There was still a lot of fish and birds and all of that stuff. But as they started building this Tamiami Trail, they had to build the canal and they're dredging up the rocks and everything. And you started seeing some of the families move from out on the islands closer to the highway being built, or Tamiami Trail, selling goods. And, I think they had a couple of native guides who were helping them through the swamp. I know at least one individual had actually taken rocks that were being dredged up eventually to build the camp. That's where our tourist village is today. That was an actual functioning village up until a certain point. But yeah, the biggest change obviously is when you have a giant road cross-cutting your swamp, that's going to impact the water flow, and that river of grass is no longer the river it used to be. I always say, and sorry if it's a little bit, crude, but if you look at your arm, this is like the Everglades flowing. If you were to cut this vein right here, that's going to do a lot of damage, right? So that's kind of how I look at the Everglades. And that's basically what they did at that time. Around 1927, 1928, you see that trail being finished, and they start putting a dike around Okeechobee. I believe at that point, the dike that was built had broke. Edward, am I getting that correct?
Yeah. I mean, it was the state that was building that stuff at the time. The trail, the dike around Okeechobee, all that. And then I think there was a hurricane or something in 1927, 1928, like winter of 27 or beginning of 28. And it overtopped that dike. It burst. And at that time, it was mainly living around the Lake Okeechobee. There were some folks from Chibuco's Tallahassee Band who became the ancestors of today's Brighton Reservation. But a lot of those folks at the time were also like Black laborers who were there to work on the farms. And a lot of folks died when that dam burst. So that brought the next players onto the scene.
Something I forgot to mention, that by this point, my people have been living down here, and we followed the seasons. We followed the environment around us. So, there's the wet and dry season. So that would necessitate travel, cohabitation between like the islands, the tree islands that you might be familiar with within the Everglades, and also within Big Cypress. So it would kind of be back and forth depending on the season. So there's always been that connection with both aspects of the land. So that's why we're so involved in both areas. Even to the point that some camps would do controlled burns. That's something a lot of indigenous communities engage with, is controlled burns of the land to provide better soil and all of that. And that comes after getting to know the land intrinsically, so you know what works and what doesn't work. Yeah, actually, we still have, I think, like 15 historical camps still located within the Big Cypress proper itself. I was just out at my grandma Peggy's camp last week. And I know whenever we used to do gigging with the students, we would always do that in front of what we call Panther Camp, a bit further down the highway. So those camps are still meaningful to us. We still have people living within those camps. And it's important to us to make sure those type of connections are maintained, especially because the people who live out there tend to be more independent. So it's almost like they're connected directly into the source. Those of us who are part of the Miccosukee tribe proper, we kind of accept that we're walking in two worlds, whereas they're still more firmly entrenched in one compared to us. So it's important to have these different perspectives and be able to maintain that at the level it's at. And that includes, kind of being able to have access to the land as you need it, as we have historically always had it. But after going back to the Tamiami Trail, after 1928, you see the Army Corps move in, and the Central and Southern Florida project begins in the 1940s until the 1960s. And by the 1940s, that kind of starts taking us into the Indian Reorganization Act era. But Edward, is there anything you wanted to speak on with that Central and Southern Florida project?
Yeah, I mean, that was just, it's a fancy name to put on top of the project to drain the Everglades. The CSFP, or Central and Southern Florida Project, is the reason the Everglades are broken.
Yeah, it's what's that phrase? Man plans and somebody laughs. I forgot, but yeah, it's always a bad idea when you want to fundamentally change whatever nature has taken, whether your beliefs are thousands, millions, or billions of years to shape, it seems to be human nature, and that's where the problem lies when you put humans before nature. It's one and the same. But moving forward after that, 1962, that's when our tribe, the Miccosukee tribe, gained federal recognition. And a big driver of that was to be able to protect our culture as we saw fit. By that point, we had diverged philosophically quite a bit from what the people up north, the Seminoles, were following. They were a little bit more willing to modernize in ways that we weren't. So we had to start working with the federal government to get federal recognition to better protect our rights, protect our culture, as well as protect the land around us. Fundamentally, that's what we've always tried to protect, is the land, because we are shaped by the land. We're from the land. It always goes back to land. And, that was actually the story behind our recognition is very interesting. There's a lot of firsts that the tribe engaged with, and it kind of carried that momentum and that perspective going forward. Whenever I go over tribal history with anybody from Miami or some of our employees, that part, it's always got to be put into context, because our people actually went to go meet with Fidel Castro in communist Cuba at the time. And, that was something that the American government was not happy with, but we haven't been happy with them a lot of times. So, you reap what you sow. And quite frankly, they were trying to stonewall us as an identity, as a nation. So after that meeting, they realized, oh, actually, these people are serious, and they're willing to engage in these efforts to be recognized. We probably should control that effort somewhat by acknowledging it, since they were here before us. You could look at it as maybe they're embarrassed or a little bit ashamed, but 1962, we got our federal recognition. And in 1974, Big Cypress Preserve was recognized as well, which is important because it acknowledges, to my mind, that there are valuable resources and that the land itself is valuable, and there should be some protections there. But obviously, there's disagreements on what type of protection should be put in place. Anything you wanted to add there, Edward?
Not at the moment.
So yeah, broadly speaking, that's kind of the history that sets up who we are. And going back to that connection with the land, we've fought tooth and nail previously. I grew up with, I was born in 89, so I'm child of the 90s, really. And I do recall the different lawsuits that happened with the tribe and Big Sugar in order to put environmental protections into place. Quite frankly, these type of battles have been ongoing since. They may not be as public, but it's been a constant fight, because there's always vast differences in opinion on how things should be managed. And the tribe has always been looking to the history to go back to more historical standards. because quite frankly, those standards were better than a lot of things put in place now.
Well, I guess that's where I'll pick up, because you kind of got us from the ancient history to recognition to the establishment of Big Cypress. And the topic of this discussion, I think, is kind of like Everglades restoration and defending sacred places. So, what do we mean when we're talking about Everglades restoration? Before I go into that, a couple quick caveats. Thank y'all for inviting me. I really appreciate it. I do want to note that I'm a member of the Southeastern Muskogee Nation, so I'm not Miccosukee. I am of the Wind Clan, which is also represented in the Miccosukee community. And I think that probably gets us into the meaty bit of this, which is the Central and Southern Florida Project was conceived of essentially as the Fourth Seminole War. You know, it was the tactic that the United States government determined to use way back in 1865, which is only 7 years after the end of the Third Seminole War, to finally get rid of the indigenous people in Florida. And when they did start dredging the Everglades, filling it in, they massively changed the ecosystem. While the Everglades Drainage District, the original attempters at draining the Everglades, had only built about 400 miles of canals, levees, dikes, and berms, they would be far outpaced by their successors, because the Army Corps would go on to build 2,175 miles of canals and 2,130 miles of levees, dikes, and berms. Now, the South Florida area has more canals than Venice, than just about anywhere in the world. And there are billions of dollars flowing into the Everglades every year, in part to build more. So how did we get there? When the CSFP was finished in the mid-1960s, it directly resulted in the last Miccosukee family leaving the Tree Islands. And honestly, pretty sure it was Houston's family. The Otter Clan folks living out on the island right off of Okeechobee finally came onto the mainland in like 1964. And they came there because the entire ecosystem had collapsed behind them. The Miccosukee today steward kind of like 4 places, but it's really just the Central Everglades, broadly speaking. It's like Big Cypress National Preserve, in which the tribe has perpetual and customary use and occupancy rights. The Federal Reservation, which is held as a reservation and trust for the tribe. The Water Conservation Area 3A, which is a perpetual lease to the tribe with use and occupancy rights, and the Miccosukee Reserved Area. And they all kind of touch each other, and it's all kind of everything just north of Everglades National Park for the most part. And everybody had moved from those lands onto the Tamiami Trail because the ecosystem was collapsing. But a lot of people were refusing to acknowledge that. And people were liking, if you were a developer, the status quo, which is there was a lot more dry land, and you just kind of squeezed all the water into the middle of the state where there aren't many people to complain about it, just some Indians, just some animals. Don't need to worry about them too much. And so you ended up, instead of with one Everglades, with 1,000 little boxes. If you look up the South Florida Water Management District Army Corps of Engineers jurisdictional map, which I'd love to show y'all right now, but having some technical difficulties, so I'm talking off my phone, you will see how expansive this infrastructure footprint is. There is no part of the Everglades which isn't shaped by CSFP. Right after CSFP, another really small change happened, but it's worth mentioning here, which is an endangered sparrow, the Cape Sable seaside sparrow, migrated north from Cape Sable, where it's indigenous to, into Everglades National Park and Big Cypress National Preserve, in areas which CSFP had artificially drained down. That same drainage made its original habitat largely uninhabitable. A combination of the drainage and a hurricane that hit it turned it into a saltwater marsh instead of freshwater. So those birds moved farther north. the vast majority of them settled on the east side of Shark River Slough, which is a little bit farther from Miccosukee Lands. One small group settled to the southwest of Miccosukee Lands in the Ochopee area. It was always primarily males, not a breeding population, not somewhere females were building nests, primarily just where males went when they failed to mate and move on to the next level of life and the more productive habitats. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service started to shift how CSFP was operating. They said, actually, this system you built to channel water away from the coasts where there's wealthy lands and into the center of the state, it's got one thing wrong. Water's flowing south. And when water flows south, it hits this population of sparrows. So we can't, let water flow south for half of the year. And so the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service released a Jeopardy opinion, which bound the Army Corps of Engineers to close the gates on the south side of tribal land, which meant starting in the 80s, tribal land, hundreds of thousands of acres, we're talking in this case about 250,000 acres, the heart of the Everglades, would flood every year so that a small subpopulation of sparrows to the southwest could be spared that water. Today, by the way, there have been 0 documented sparrows in that subpopulation for 5 or 6 years, but they're still closing the gates every year, flooding the tribe and all the animals that live there to artificially dry out an area that was artificially dried out by CSFP in the first place. Now, what this starts is a chain reaction. Because in 1982, shortly after that sparrow designation happened, there was a mercy kill. The Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission realized everything is starving in the Everglades. So we're just going to solve that by handing out a bunch of hunting tags. So they go down and they kill off about 1,000 deer in a week or two. And they say, okay, we're good now. The deer have enough food. Lo and behold, in the early 90s, I think 94, 2,000 deer died in 1 week of massive floods. And the Miccosukee are sitting here watching not just the deer die, but the tree islands that they're standing on go underwater. They're watching not just deer disappear, but pretty much every mammal species. In the last couple decades, I believe the statistic is that there has been a 97 to 98% die-off of small and mid-sized mammals within tribal lands, primarily because the tree islands, the sole refuge for those terrestrial mammals, are getting flooded and put underwater to save a different animal, which isn't even there, about 50 miles away. So that's kind of what we're dealing with, is these big sort of bureaucratic movements that are not at all tethered to what's happening on the ground. And one of the other big things Miccosukee was dealing with, other than the floods, the water quantity, is the water quality. Because all the water coming onto Miccosukee tribal lands was coming through basically 3 canals. 2 that were joining on the middle of the federal reservation, bringing a bunch of ranch pollution and a bunch of Everglades agricultural area row crop, sugarcane, tomato pollution, a little bit of Orlando pollution in there, just to make it a good sauce. And it comes down and pours onto tribal lands, where it creates a 5,000 acre and exponentially growing plume of invasive and nuisance vegetation. Because the Everglades is oligotrophic, it's naturally low nutrient area. So when you introduce a lot of phosphorus, a lot of nitrogen, you totally shift the vegetative communities in that area. So now we're not even at the turn of the millennia yet, and Miccosukee is already seeing their water poisoned and their traditional homelands flooded. It got to the point that the Miccosukee imposed, and honestly, this is still in effect, a guidance that tribal members should only be eating 1 fish a month. And to kind of underscore how significant that is, my tribe, they're Muskogees, they're Creeks. We have a little bit of a history with cattle, a little bit of a history with some other animals, some other food products, but the Miccosukee have always been a people that are closely connected to low-lying wetlands. They've always been a people who relied on turtles and fish and frogs as food. All of that in this period disappears from the plates of the Miccosukee people. Today, there are a lot of health issues that are a result of this sharp disconnection from the traditional foodways. So in the 1990s, Miccosukee tries to do something about it. They do something about it before the federal government does anything about it. And Miccosukee decides to take onto itself the authority to regulate water quality. Now, for a long time, the federal government totally controlled federal reservations. They told you, they appointed your chairman. They told you, who your police were, who your firefighters were, who your lawyer was. And every reservation in the entire United States has a Bureau of Indian Affairs agency where the agent tells you what to do. And right when they set up the Bureau of Indian Affairs agency on Miccosukee land, the agent shows up on Monday and finds that all of the furniture, all of the file cabinets had been reappropriated by the Miccosukee tribe, and they were in fact out of the job. And the Miccosukee chairman at that time, I think Popeye's grandfather, unless it was a little bit prior to that period, might have been Sonny, might have been Billy, I'm not really sure, declared himself the acting superintendent of the Bureau of Indian Affairs agency, taking onto itself the administration of its own affairs. This was the first tribe to do it, but Nixon followed suit by letting all the other tribes start to take on these pieces of tribal administration. One of these pieces was the Clean Water Act. So it let the tribe take from the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, the authority to regulate its own water quality using EPA authority. So the tribe is actually sort of acting as an extension of the EPA in that context. And the tribe set in the 1990s 10 parts per billion total phosphorus as the limitation for phosphorus levels entering its reservation. At that time, phosphorus levels entering the reservation were about 200 or 300 parts per billion, about 20 or 30 times what Miccosukee was looking at the historical records and saying should be the level of phosphorus. And so, did the agencies listen? No. And so Miccosukee sues for the next 15 to 20 years. And my predecessors in the legal department successfully got Judge Gold to issue a consent decree sometime in the early 2010s, I think 2013, if not 2012, which finally bound the state agencies and the federal agencies in that region to listen to the Miccosukee water quality standards. Now, everything that gets planned for the Miccosukee or for Everglades restoration generally, that is in any way going to pass through the federal reservation gets hit by that water quality standard. The Army Corps didn't come up with a water quality standard for the Everglades. Miccosukee did, but now Army Corps has to use it.
Edward, if I could just add one little thing, even that standard, we didn't set it. We were just trying to hit what nature had already set before us. So just reinforcing that idea.
Yeah, absolutely. And the federal government in this period of time was noticing something was wrong too. They noticed, oh, we broke the Everglades. It's kind of hard to miss when like 2,000 deer float past you in the 90s that something's broken. And so in 1998, they do a comprehensive review of the Central and Southern Florida Project. And this was called the Yellow Book. And it basically said, we broke the Everglades. And it said, here's how we can fix the Everglades. Honestly, you can read the Yellow Book. It's not like the gospel or anything, but it's pretty cool. It's not that long. And it just kind of goes through all the ways the Army Corps broke things and how they thought maybe they needed to fix things. And so 2 years later in 2000, Congress authorizes the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan, which really gets rolled out of the Yellow Book from 2 years prior, where they looked at everything they broke. And you'd think they fixed it now, right? They came up with something that is going to allow them to go back through and fix everything. I can tell you we're about $10 billion in and the Everglades is still broken. And how that happened is CERT authorized 68 plus component projects. Those projects had the stated intention of restoring water flow, water quantity, water timing, water delivery, all the things they broke by chopping the Everglades into 100 pieces. And it actually included water quality treatment too. They made these giant boxes, 1,000 acres wide, with a bunch of little boxes in it that you can push water through slowly to pull out pollutants. And they stay there, and they can like dredge them up and go dump them in a landfill if they want. And they do that every so often to maintain them. But they come up with this plan, and it could have worked, except for one important thing. It's called the savings clause. The savings clause says that the Army Corps can never flood anybody, which sounds great, right? Because you want the people building your dams and your levees and your dikes to probably not flood you. The problem is the Everglades got drained, and a bunch of people went into the Everglades and built houses. So now the challenge is to restore a landscape, which requires putting more water onto it, but now there's people there, and you can't put water near the people. And so what you started seeing is this grand vision in the Yellow Book and in CERP start to get diluted and watered down. Oh, and then the ag lobby comes in. They can't deal with, having any less water because they need it to irrigate their fields. Oh, and then, we have this species specific protection for the Cape Sable seaside sparrow. So yeah, while water is supposed to go down into Everglades National Park, we're just going to keep blocking it off at Tamiami Trail because of that one bird. And you just start to see all these, and this is kind of the essence of the problems of Everglades restoration, is there's so many interest groups. There's so many ways the money can go. Even the contracts themselves, one project could be $2, $3, $4 billion. So who gets the contract, how quickly they finish the project, whether they submit a change order for an extra 100 million after a year or two because, they might have underestimated when they did the bid for the project. Those things are just kind of part of the system. And the tribe, when we're talking about tribal lands that are broken and how Everglades restoration is going to fix it, there's really only 2 of those 68 component projects that do anything for the tribe. One is called SEP, which would fix the Central Everglades. It's mainly a plumbing thing. They're deleting levees, they're adding, flowways and flow gates and culverts. It's all good stuff, broadly speaking. But then they decided to take out the section of the levee that was right north of a tribal village. So the village would go underwater. So we actually had to, for the last several years, push Congress to appropriate money. It's not done yet, but I think it's going to happen, to lift that village out of the floodwaters, the engineered floodwaters, without which they couldn't even move forward with the project because they have a savings clause that forbids them from flooding anybody. Which, this is building on all these layers of complexity. And then there's also the operational plan. We have SEP, sure, you replumb it, but do you keep closing all the gates every year because of the sparrow that's no longer there? That's an operational planning question. That comes about 3 or 4 years after the completion of construction. And then the other project we're really interested in, the Western Everglades Restoration Project, has the biggest footprint of any of the comprehensive Everglades restoration projects. It's the only one the tribe actually asked for. So of course it got deauthorized. And then it got reauthorized again. And then they deauthorized it again. And we finally got the Assistant Secretary of the Army to reauthorize it in February of this year. And they're scrambling to get it to the Senate in time for markup. Senate deadline is 2 months prior to the earliest possible time the Army Corps could finish the planning process. So we really just have to hope for at least 2 months worth of dysfunction on the Senate side, which is not an unrealistic hope. But that has to be accompanied by no dysfunction on the Army Corps side to get to that deadline. Now, if we get to that deadline, they are going to close those 2 main canals, bringing polluted water into tribal lands. That water will flow by sheet flow thinly over the land. That pollution will fall out a little bit. And by the time that water makes it to tribal land, it won't be causing the same. And then there will also be a piece that is reconnecting the tribe's watershed and the River of Grass and Shark River to Big Cypress, and pulling some of the water into the Okaloakoche and Kissimmee Billy sloughs, which historically hydrated Big Cypress, but are largely dried down. Now, would anyone guess what the main resistance to that project was?
Sugar? Cattle?
Second one,
Cattle.
it's just landowners who are there, who have a house, who
Yeah.
say, built this house 40 years ago. I brought my cattle, 40 years ago. I'm a third generation rancher here. Who are you to put water on the corner of my property? And so we've been fighting that one for a while. I think we've reached a little bit of a consensus point. I think we're moving toward project authorization. One of the only reasons we've been able to get there is because the Biden administration, Secretary Holland and Director Chuck Sams have decided to honor tribal, traditional, ecological knowledge. And if we package that indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, that ITEC correctly, and I say correctly because there's about 100 pages of guidance memoranda on how you can package it, which tie into the Information Quality Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, and all these, ridiculous extra levels of bureaucracy. That's why I have a job. And we've sort of built them into these very neatly packaged statements coming directly from chairmen saying, this is the tribe's position, this is where the tribe's historical knowledge comes from. And when we package it like that and send it to the agencies, they have to treat it on parity with peer-reviewed scientific publications according to statute, or they open themselves up to a challenge under the Administrative Procedures Act. So we are now able to actually have a voice, and we are now shaping the direction of the science. The tribe has like 20-something scientists between land resources, water resources, fish and wildlife, etc. So there's a lot of human resources and scientific capital really that's here, that we're just trying to figure out how to put the tribe in the driver's seat finally, after a century of seeing the Everglades dredged and destroyed. We are now hopefully on the cusp of reversing that trend, of fixing the water quality, of fixing the flow of the water. We have had to invest a lot of money in lobbying, a lot of efforts into building our advocacy profile, a lot of time and relationship building into getting everybody on the same page. But I think we're there. And that's Everglades restoration. And I know there's also a call to action towards the end of this event about an issue that the tribe is experiencing in Big Cypress National Preserve. I'll speak to that super briefly, like 30, 60 seconds, but that's been what I've been dealing with for the last 2 weeks, because the National Park Service was really sneaky. They took the thing that the conservationists wanted the most, wilderness, the thing the sportsmen wanted the most, expanded off-road vehicle access. They usually hate each other for those policy positions and go against each other. The tribe would prefer no expanded off-road vehicle access in the preserve. The tribe would also prefer not to have a wilderness designation, because wilderness, the entire concept of wilderness, is inherently anti-indigenous. It comes from this period of the National Park Service's founding, where you had Teddy Roosevelt and John Muir and a bunch of respectfully, old white dudes with military backgrounds deciding what to do with the land they just finished taking from the Indians 20 years prior. And so they come up with the wilderness system of management, which says land which is untrammeled by man, which does not have the markings of human habitation, which is able to be managed in such a way that you cannot tell that humans were ever there. That kind of land can be brought into a wilderness designation. People can be cut out of it, and then the land's going to be beautiful and perfect. And that's this fundamental misunderstanding of the role of humanity in a landscape, because humanity in a landscape, in a traditional way, in a good way. We're just animals. We're just a part of that habitat. It is true that when we take on mindsets which are colonial, which are imperial, which are focused on, taking and, removing from others a particular asset, when we take that on, we can be bad for the ecosystem. But a place like Big Cypress, when it is still connected to its traditional stewards, is a much healthier place than a Big Cypress not connected to its stewards. And what they want to do will stop tribal members from accessing their traditional spaces in the name of conservation, but it's fortress conservation. It's happening right now in Tanzania, where they're evicting 150,000 Maasai people from the Ngorongoro conservation area, because they're like, well, can't be conserved if there's humans. And these are the people that have been living there, conserving it for centuries. I do want to briefly respond to one of the comments, and I'm going to hand it back over to y'all for the FAQ bit. But Burmese pythons are a fascinating question down here in the Everglades. They're absolutely invasive. They are absolutely having a disproportionate impact on the populations of birds, of mammals, of reptiles, of fish. However, they are a great scapegoat for agencies who do not want to change the way they are managing water. So while they are a legitimate threat to the Everglades, they are not the only threat to the Everglades. You have to both fix the water and fix the communities. It's a both and, not an either or. All right, thank y'all.
Yeah, speaking to Edward's point there at the end, it's not the pythons that are giving deer hoof rot. So a lot of things going on out here. Before go to the question portion, I guess I did want to just reinforce a couple of things Edward hit upon there, which Edward, great job. You guys can see why I wanted him to be a part of this. I look at it almost like a sandwich. I'm the bread on both ends. He's the meat of it. But you go away thinking, oh, what a great sandwich. And it's like, well, it's mostly the middle part. But anyway, part of the reason we are so focused on all of this is because we actually carried our cultural duties into our civic duty. Our constitution, the tribe's constitution, is the only one that I'm aware of that actually says in the preamble that we have to conserve and develop our land and resources. And that conserve part is so important to us. And as I mentioned before, it's not like we're setting these standards. We're just going back to the history that we've always known what worked before. And just like this idea, if it worked before, it can work again. That's why I always say we are the only stakeholders out here who are not doing this for any economic reason. Even these environmental groups are still driven by money because they need money to function, to promote their cause and everything like that. We survived out in the Everglades before there was money around, so we know we could do it again. And that's why it's just out of a sense of duty to save what saved us. It really goes back to that. And I wanted to comment on the Cape sable sparrow that Edward had mentioned, because that has been a recurring issue. And, it's a difference of how we look at life, I guess, because I know from my conversations with people, American individualism as a concept, it's got its good and its bad. It makes you want to leave a legacy, but sometimes your personal legacy overrides the objectives that would benefit everybody else. So you might actually have individuals within the governments who are like, oh, this bird will be my legacy if I can save this bird. But I have taken the habit of telling these people in the government, well, I'm from Bird Clan. You care more about this bird that's not there instead of these birds that are there. So it's trying to leave the right legacy. And not being misguided in your efforts. And that's why it's always important to reach out to the people who are on that land before everybody else to get a better sense of what that actual connection should be. But again, great job, Edward. He pretty much set the table there and gave you all pretty much what you need to know for this conversation.
No, great job, Popeye. As you probably know, I'm a vegetarian, so I don't want to be the meat. Happy berry picker.
That was amazing. Amazing. Mato, thank you very much to Popeye and to Edward. That was awesome. Thank you. That was a masterful, witty, and pragmatic foray through multiple histories, critiquing official narratives, pointing out imbalances, and offering useful and practical tips forward. Thank you very much, gentlemen. So I want to open us up to an opportunity for Q&A, but we're going to try our best to do that, collecting the questions that we want to ask in the chat box. We were hoping to just see a list of questions, and then hopefully Popeye or Edward can see the questions and pick which ones they want to answer. But go ahead and drop in some questions. I know we've already passed through some questions in the chat. So even as you add more, I'm just going to review. I'm not sure if Popeye or Edward had a chance to see some of the questions that were asked. So I'm just going to review them, but go ahead and pop in new questions now in the chat box, and we'll have a chance for them to reply. I'm just reviewing some things that already passed through in the chat box. Rhonda Ruff wants to know, are you guys okay with opening wildlands to more non-Indigenous people? And how will Amendment 2, if passed, affect this? So you can consider that question if you want to address that. There was also a question about leadership. Somebody was noticing that the leadership in the Miccosukee tribe right now happens to be all male, and they were wondering about leadership by women. So that's something that they might want to consider addressing. I'm just reviewing the chat box now. Let me just see if there's
Houston,
anything
sorry,
else
if you don't
missed.
mind me taking a crack at those first two questions.
Yeah,
but
go ahead.
Leave Rhonda's for me, Popeye.
Okay, yeah. So I will say, as far Rhonda's was the one geared towards Amendment 2. And okay, all right. So the leadership thing, I think historically speaking, we are matriarchal. So it's like the family and the camps broadly would obviously go with what grandma or mom is saying. But it seems like a lot of the politics were more interfacing with men. But that's not to say the current modern politics as we engage with it should stay the same. Honestly, it's unfortunately, I think, a historical ramification of dealing with non-natives and seeing how they engage with politics. Historically, it's been men in American society that were the movers and shakers, at least at the big meetings. Certainly when our people were having meetings in the 50s and throughout this time, it seems like it's been men. And I think some of that has bled into our people, which is why it's so important for us to stay connected and go back to our roots. I was going to say something, I guess, a little bit more women positive, but then I remembered women are people and I have a problem with adults in general, because I always say that kids have to treat adults with the dignity and respect I just usually reserve for children. But, you know, it's a mistake to cut off half your population from the decision-making process. I mean, you're missing a whole different perspective there. So I have made concentrated efforts to try and encourage the younger generations, the females especially, to feel empowered to step up as they get older. I am proud to say our student business council is primarily women. And I do find that a lot of the younger women tend to be more, I mean, women tend to emotionally mature faster than men in my experience. So it tends to be our younger women that are actually more involved with a lot of these community events and things like that. So I'm trying to make sure they feel supported. That's half the reason I have the long hair, so they feel like they're already here, so they can just step in. Edward, you said you want to take a crack at Rhonda's question.
Yeah, mainly because Rhonda, I appreciate your question, and the tribe is engaged in this issue, but has not yet developed a position on Amendment 2. Sorry, that's my lawyer moment today. I will also respond to one of the other comments here about sacred sites. So the law of concern that already prevents the tribe from accessing sacred sites in the Everglades, but may also be expanded to applying to Big Cypress National Preserve, is the Wilderness Act of 1964. It has certain management imperatives that, among other things, stop you from using like vehicles and stop you from living in a place. So in particular, the concern is the tribe has like occupancy rights within Big Cypress, and it will no longer be able to exercise those occupancy rights in the places where wildernesses designate it. And further, this is a massive area. Like we're talking hundreds of square miles. And so it is like essentially telling the elders they are banned from an area if you tell them they can't take a vehicle in there anymore because they're elders. And, you know, Miccosukee, like everyone else, does have vehicles. So these are kind of the concerns with the wilderness designations.
Awesome.
I
Thank
saw
you.
somebody had a
Looks like we have-
question about, sorry for interrupting. I saw somebody had a question about the term invasives and how some indigenous might feel that it is a colonizer or colonialist term or mindset. I mean, tribes can use whatever language they want for it, but the fact of the matter is when this species that was not shaped by this land is in this land and it's completely wiping everything out, that's causing discordance. It's not in balance. So to me, call it whatever you want, but in English, I think invasive works. I don't begrudge any tribe or other people wanting to approach that differently. That's their right as a sovereign, as a member of a sovereign nation. You know, I gotta respect their perspective. It's not mine, but that's part of what sovereignty is, right? Not everybody's going to agree on everything, or else we wouldn't have treaties and truce, peace talks, and all that stuff.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on Linda's question as well here about what language we should use when talking about, you know, spaces which are natural. And I think a lot of the times we are in a box created by our language. And this is something you become especially aware of if you speak other languages. And I'm sure I occasionally will say wilderness or wild places or those kind of terms. But those are really loaded terms in English. And if we look at the Declaration of Independence, Article 27, Sentence 2, maybe 3, it talks about the merciless Indian savages whose only means of warfare is brutal depredation. Go look up Article 27 of the Declaration of Independence. I see someone keeps putting all the right links in the chat, so maybe someone can do it here. And this language of wildness, of savagery, of, on the converse, of civilization, of tameness, this rhetoric is something which has been incredibly pernicious and incredibly useful to those people who have sought to separate indigenous people from indigenous lands. If you go through the entirety of the last 3 centuries of legal jurisprudence, which I had to get my degree, you will find this language repeated over and over. Popeye referenced some cases in Georgia from the 1820s and 30s. What they basically said is tribes, they're savages. They don't improve land. They don't build fences. If they built fences, maybe they'd own land, but they don't own land because they don't build fences. They don't improve it. They don't separate the tame from the wild. Therefore, they cannot have ownership in the same way we English do. Because we English, well, we go to a land, we denude it of all its vegetation and all of its trees, we lay sod down, we put sheep on top of the sod, and then we look out on the glorious countryside. And really, there's nothing wrong with English people doing that with English land. It's their prerogative. If they want to manage a certain amount of that land to primarily be agricultural, a certain amount of that land to be, you know, natural, whatever the case may be, that's their prerogative. But when you bring that ideology to the Americas, you immediately see this conflict in political philosophies, and this idea emerges, which was largely brought to the fore by the early generation of founding conservationists, that there is bad, disturbed land where the humans are, and there's wild land where nobody is. And we have to get more to the wild land. And this also results in, I'll quit talking in a second, this is also why the Nazis in the 1930s and 1940s were big conservationists. They loved the concept of saving the environment, specifically when you tie the concept of saving the environment to getting rid of all the people that from your perspective, are ruining the environment. And so much of the early and sort of like medium period National Socialist propaganda. Oh, and I'm part Jewish too, so this is like another side interest of mine. So much of that propaganda, so much of that language is based in this idea that, you know, the soil is innately ours. We are, you know, in a place that should be managed in a certain way, and the primary change from current management to subsequent management is the eviction of the lesser races which are polluting the earth. And so they said, or actually Hitler said in his Mein Kampf, let the Danube be our Mississippi. His concentration camp idea comes from Fort Brooke, which is in Tampa Bay, and the Indian removal process that saw the concentration and ethnic cleansing of indigenous people from Florida, Georgia, Alabama. This is the history of the Miccosukee and Seminole people. It is a history that saw them be tens of thousands strong at the beginning of the Second Seminole War and have less than 200 people left in Florida by the end of the Second Seminole War. And the moral of that story is don't go to the Tampa Bay Lightning hockey games because they built their stadium on a mass grave.
Powerful, powerful. Gentlemen, thank you so much. We do have another guest that wants to ask a question, and they are a member of another Indigenous community. I would like to ask them to introduce themselves and share their question or comment. Mr. Joe Frank.
Well, I guess, sorry, while Joe was getting ready, I did want to comment a little bit on Edward's mention of going back to wilderness and that term and Theodore Roosevelt's time. But even before that, you know, it's just the further, it's further perpetuating the idea that manifest destiny started and what the colonists coming over here had in mind anyway, which is just they're not doing anything with this land. They don't need this land. And even the idea of wilderness is a misconception because that's what the mindset they came over here with, as we're taming the wilderness, when really they kind of just revived a lot of village space and trails that have been established by the indigenous people already, who by that point had primarily been wiped out through disease. And then warfare does its work. But this idea of wilderness is really just a big mythology that's perpetuated that helps kind of put a big band-aid over a lot of this horrible stuff that's happened throughout time. But, you know, I always like to point to corn. You know, they say that corn started off in like, you know, Mesoamerica area as teosinte. It didn't look like it did today, but it was cultivated to the crop we're familiar with. And if that type of crop is able to get across the country, that it's become such an intrinsic part of all these different tribes, and it's thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away from where it originated, that tells you, well, then there's a lot more connection going on than you've been led to believe. So yeah, just the idea of wilderness is just the myth, and that just helps to kind of glide over a lot of important indigenous history and how the land was shaped and cultivated.
I was just going to say, I dropped the link in. It looks like a really ugly link. It says it's Google Ad Services. It's because I copy pasted it on my phone. It's to a book called Savage Anxieties by a former professor of mine, Rob Williams, who's of the Lumbee tribe up in North Carolina. And it does a great job kind of talking about how Western civilization is kind of built around this language of savagery, of wildness, of tameness, etc.
Great resources. Great resources. Thank you.
Earlier, it was put in the chat that there's a letter to send to President Biden and Deb Haaland. I'm going to put that about Big Cypress and this wilderness issue. So I'm putting that link back in the chat now for everybody. And for those that tried it before, it works now. If you weren't successful before, it'll work now.
And just to comment briefly on that technical issue, as far as we can tell, that's because too many people cared about the Miccosukee or trying to submit their letter at the same time. So if you do care about the Miccosukee, please join all those people who crashed the server on Friday in submitting your letter. And I do want to briefly address a comment that I think I saw in the chat that hasn't been addressed about language. I think that from my perspective as a Muskogee, we're not very private about our language. We love when, other people use a little loan word or two of significance. That is not the case for everybody. Probably not the case with a lot of Miccosukee folks. So I'd turn it over to Popeye or Houston to address that use of indigenous language in naming plants and stuff.
It's, with us, it seems to be like we operate on like, here's a very, very, very limited wine tasting menu. Switch it around a little bit, just these few options, and then that's it. Don't take it with you. That's where it's like Chintamo, Shinabashat. We're comfortable with these basic things, but for very obvious historical reasons, we're not like, here is everything. Gotta leave some cards in your hand.
If those reasons aren't as obvious, what happened was in the 40s, and then again in the 60s, and then again in the 80s, academics came out to the Miccosukee tribe, did a lot of interviews, and published a lot of traditional information that was not appreciated by the tribe. Part of my first year on this job was, writing to the Smithsonian and stuff to get them to take down that, inappropriate cultural information. And so guarding the language is seen as a way to guard that information in many cases, because it's so embedded in the language itself.
Yeah, our belief is that there's power in the language we speak, so we don't necessarily want to give that power up to somebody else.
I think one of the things that has been discussed here, that the history was good. There's a lot of blanks that can be filled in. But the core and district, as far as Everglades restoration is going today, the water quality is being ignored. I think they have to ignore water quality to move all the farm runoff south instead of to the east and west coast estuaries. The present planning that they're doing now only calls for building these 20-foot deep reservoirs to hold all that dirty water, and they have no place to put it to clean it. And the Western Everglades, I know where I live upstream from the Miccosukee lands, and I know the government, the state and the federal, has a way of trying to work with each tribe separately to eventually pit the two tribes against each other. Whereas if everybody met in the same room together, I think a solution could be reached. The current plans for Western Everglades calls for diverting the cleanest water possible away from Seminole and from Miccosukee and replacing it with the dirtiest water coming off the farm fields. Eventually, that crud is going to build up on the Big Cypress Reservation, and it will pit the two tribes against each other because the government will say we're responsible for it. So I think the tribes need to work together, and I hope, Popeye, that you can help facilitate that as much as the governments, state and federal, try to keep the tribes apart. Also, there's been some concern expressed about the Eastern Everglades and the Western Everglades National Park being opened up for more use and being also declared wilderness at the same time, which is contradictory. The procedure that's being used is kind of locking the tribes out. And, the documents are kind of vague about it. I think the federal government needs to back up what it says and sit down with the Miccosukees, the Seminoles and the independent Seminoles and codify what existing uses are and what kind of needs the tribal members are going to have as far as access to some of these places, and as well as some places that shouldn't be accessed by the general public. I don't really see that in the document, so I think everybody that's listening in, if y'all want to help out, please insist on the state and the Corps taking every step that they can to clean the water up at the source. Initially, when this started, back in the 80s and 90s, I remember they sold the plans to Everglades Restoration to the tribes with basically three promises. One was to take the levees down, get the water quality right, and get the quantity moving. And so far, here we are, 20, 30 years later, and none of those goals have been met. And I think that the steps that's being taken now are only going to lead to more problems, which is going to cost the American taxpayers many billions of dollars more to correct. So, those listening and getting involved, please stay involved and press your governments to think this through. So thank you for letting me make some comments.
Joe Shinabish for that. And if you could still hear me, yeah, I'd love to try to facilitate something where we can talk and see how we can work together. Obviously, historically, other governments have seen divide and conquer work on tribes. So I think it's better if we do the reverse, right? Not trying to compare us to animals, although we are in the end, but I love Planet of the Apes. And I recall they say apes stronger together, right? So I will have to talk to the other guys on business council because I am only one finger on the hand. Sometimes I'm the thumb, sometimes I'm the pointer, sometimes I'm the middle, but I'm still just one finger. So I got to make sure the other guys are on board and that it's something that we can move forward with together. But I have been wanting to work with Seminole on environmental efforts for so long. And I know that there are younger people within the Seminole tribe who kind of see eye to eye with that perspective of us working together when it comes to the environment. So yeah, I would like to see what's possible. And I think that's important to actually get these things accomplished. And I think that would hopefully tie into other efforts we can maybe collaborate on that maybe I can talk to you about further when maybe we meet in person. But definitely, that has been a goal of mine.
To all of our friends and family here on this workshop, this is what you call diplomacy in action. We've just had some amazing commentary by an elder from the Seminole Tribe of Florida who has offered advice on things to be wary of, but also offered opportunities for collaboration with a long view of care for the environment. So thank you very much, Mr. Frank, for joining the conversation. I think this is a good time to say thank you very much to our special guest, the Honorable William J. Osceola, Popeye. Say thank you very much to Mr. Edward Ornstein, Esquire. What you have shared with us has been awesome, awesome, awesome. We're going to go ahead and continue with the program, but I just want to say thank you again. And if our attendees want to offer any gratitude or comments, whatever, we're going to be saving those comments in the chat. So drop it in the chat. Go ahead and put your notes there. And we're going to continue working with the chat box now. But I do want to say thank you again to Popeye and Edward. You're welcome to stay for as we wrap up the session. Or if you have to go, we also respect that too. But we're just going to take some moments to wrap up our session for tonight. So again, Mato Shunabisha, thank you very much.
Oh, Shinabish, I'd love to stay, but my dog has been waiting for me to give him a walk for like an hour and a half now. So I will say, if somebody has Joe's contact, if they'd be able to get that information to me so I could reach out to him.
Okay, we'll make sure to get you connected.
Oh.
And All right, my bad. So I do want to mention, Mr. Joe Frank did add a little thing I want to key in on. The second thing he said, there's not just wilderness being proposed in Big Cypress. There is also it's kind of the reverse. The Everglades stewardship plan is looking to open access to a bunch of tree islands which have otherwise been closed. So that's a totally different issue to address, but one we're about to turn to soon. Thank you.
And again, you got cut off in there. You kind of got cut off, so I want to make sure we heard you correctly. That wilderness is being proposed for Big Cypress National Preserve, but you're also concerned about the Everglades Stewardship Plan, which opens up access to tree islands that didn't have access before. Did we hear that correctly, or are we missing any details?
You did hear that correctly, and like Mr. Joe Frank mentioned, I don't think they actually said which tree islands they wanted to open up to public visitation.
Okay. Thank you for emphasizing that, and thank you for highlighting that.
Thank y'all.
All right. Well, again, thank you very much. Feel free to drop any comments in the chat to our guests and attendees, and then I will make sure to save those comments. So I do want to take just a quick couple minutes, just super quick survey to see how everybody's doing on their service projects and their action plans. And just I'm going to ask you a couple of questions. And if you're able to type your answers in the chat box, just go ahead and type your answers in the chat box. And I'm just trying to get like a large collection of what people's answers are. So we're just going to collect them and look at them later. But the first question I want to ask of our attendees, if you can type it in the chat, did you finish your land acknowledgement? Is it done or is it in process? I just want to see like how many is done and how many are still working on it. Just go ahead and drop it in the chat box. So I want to see, good. I see some people commenting. Please go ahead and comment now. And these are meant to be a draft, like these are meant to be living, these are meant to be evolving. So I just want to see how people are, where people are on that. That's great. I see some people are doing great work. Awesome. So keep typing your answer if you haven't done so yet. The next question I want to ask you is regarding your service project. Do you have the plan already? And have you started yet? I have the plan, or I'm still working on my plan, or I've started, those kind of things. Let me know how you are doing on your plan or your service project. I'm still developing the idea, or I've already started, or I'm actually in a group of people. Those are the kinds of things I want to hear from you. How are you doing on your plan? Have you started on it? Are you in a group, or are you working solo? Good, good. I see some people that are doing great work. That's awesome. So again, just trying to get an assessment of how people are doing so we can offer support. This is so that we can help you, so that we can make sure that we make progress on our projects. So this is just to see how people are doing and where we can add additional support. That's great. Thank you very much for your feedback. And then finally, I want to see if people are working solo or if you've been able to collaborate with other people in this group. So I just want to hear like solo, or I found my colleagues, or we're in a pod, we're working together. What's going on with the community here? Is this something you're working solo, or is this something you're working in a group? And I just want to see like how people are doing. So some people are in pods, some people are working solo. Others are working solo, but looking to connect in Orlando. Some are open to working with community. Some want to build community. That's great. That's great. So keep dropping in your answers and we'll keep moving on. So if you have any additional information that you want to drop in there, or I need help with this, or can you help me with that? Go ahead and put those kind of comments in there as I continue. So as we continue and wrap up, I just want to say that I'm super proud of y'all. Y'all are so awesome. Y'all are amazing. And I'm really grateful for being able to spend this time with you and to dream and to put things into action with y'all. Y'all are really awesome. There's been some people that have been super helpful, that have been reaching out, that has been offering support. there's also been some people that are like taking the initiative to create like the Signal group, like a group in the Signal app, and others that have been really offering great ideas. So I just want to say thank you to Jess Kovac. I'm sorry if I get your names wrong pronounced, but Jess Kovac, our friend Jaime, our friend Harume Abe, our friend Janine Massey, our friend Kat, and Morgana on Signal. They've been really inspiring us. So I just want to say thank you very much. And as we close out, I'm going to pass it on to, was Holly going to say something, or did Linda want to say something quick, or should we just close it out? I just wanted to check in with Holly and Linda.
Yeah, I just have a few words to say, and that's that I have links I'm going to drop in the chat, or Allie will drop in the chat now. The first one I've already dropped was the Big Cypress letter link. But we're also going to put again the journal workbook in the link, and this version of it, it should be black and white, so easier for some of you to read. I have found this extremely helpful for me guiding my own self through this experience. So I think if you take a look at it, it might help you solidify some of your questions and also your intentions to move into action. There's also a two-spirit identity event that 2 people attending this are putting on, have taken the initiative to do that. And I believe that's on Wednesday, the 25th. And there's a flyer that Allie's going to put in the chat, and contacting Kat, she can give you the link to this two-spirit discussion. It should be very lively, and it's so in keeping with what we're going to be working on next week. Also, there's a Facebook group, and 35 of you have joined it. Some of you I know don't do Facebook, and that's fine. But if you are on Facebook, please join our Facebook group where people have been posting really interesting and good resources there. So that's a way we can stay in touch. And then the last way that I have that we can stay in touch is something that I would consider it my moving into action, and that's to help create a monthly Zoom where everybody can check in once a month. Would you all like that? Are you interested in that? So I think between Linda and Gary and I, we can get that set up through the Reset Center, and we'll announce the date next week. We're thinking 1 day a month. You like that? Okay, that's it.
Thank you, Holly.
You're welcome.
And before we move on to Linda, I do wanted to, there was something I forgot to share with you all. I was asking about the status of your action plans and your service projects, because if there's some people that are having a little bit of trouble formulating an idea or what you would like to do or work on, we have also compiled a small list of suggestions that you can actually like support us with. So if you're thinking, oh, I'm having trouble figuring out what I can do or where I can plug in to support, and if you need suggestions or ideas, we're going to put some documents in the chat box that you can download, and then we'll also make sure to send it out to you in the email as well. But if you want to just have it ready right now, I'm going to ask my friend Ali on the tech support team to put the 2 documents in the chat. It's the same document, but one of them is a Word format, and I tried to make the PDF with links clickable, but it didn't happen. But so I'm giving you a Word document and a PDF version of the same thing. And that lists some actions that we're asking for support on. It lists some upcoming events that you can attend that are Indigenous led or have Indigenous focus or issues that we're highlighting. We also offer some values to consider. We also offer a list of organizations that you can learn more about and support in some way. So this is the document in the chat box. The first one is the Word document, and then we're going to put in a PDF. So check it out. Reach out to me if you have any questions, and then Linda, and then final words. Thank you. Linda, take it away.
All right, thank you. I want to tell you that our guest speakers for next week are Sergio Papa Rourke and Robert Rosa will be with us. And don't forget your homework, which you can find the link to it on our website, the southwestflorida.org website. And it's basically, we're going to cover gender diversity and action next week. So please, please come back and join us again. This is a great program. I mean, this is just amazing this year. And these two speakers were awesome, Houston. This was quite the
Thank
country.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Linda. So just keep in mind that we have been in the presence of local and international Indigenous leaders. We are laying the groundwork for reconciliation. We are going beyond land acknowledgement and into action, and we are poised for opportunities to define new relationships with our Indigenous neighbors and our Indigenous hosts. We are creating a community of support with the golden rule always in mind. So thank you very much, and we'll see you next week. Have a good night. Much love.
Good night.
Good night, everyone. If anybody wants to stay on and chat, we'll keep it open for another 10 minutes or so. If anybody wants to connect, we're here for you.